The petroleum industry engaged in coordinated research and communications on air pollution issues from the 1940s onward. The petroleum industry has long been highly coordinated, acting through centralized industry associations. The Western Oil and Gas Association, now the Western States Petroleum Association, was founded in 1907 and represents petroleum companies in the Western United States. The American Petroleum Institute was created in 1919 to represent the American petroleum industry as a whole. From the time the American Petroleum Institute was founded, oil companies recognized pollution issues as an area of significant common concern. And by the 1930s, they had focused particularly on the industry's shared concerns with air pollution and the related public hostility and risk of regulation it presented. In the 1940s, Los Angeles, California, grappled with increasingly severe and debilitating smog. In late 1946, executives from the major petroleum companies, represented by the Western Oil and Gas Association, established the Committee on Smoke and Fumes of the Western Oil and Gas Association to fund research into the causes of air pollution in Southern California. The committee was explicitly created not just to conduct research, but also to communicate that research to the media, public, and decision makers with the express goal of discouraging pollution regulations the industry deemed costly and unnecessary. A report on the committee's work by Esso, now ExxonMobil, Executive G.A. Lloyd, highlighted the central role that understanding and shaping public opinion played in the work and the objectives of the Smoke and Fumes Committee, highlighting that an information committee populated with public relations representatives was a key part of the enterprise. Lloyd outlined their key priorities. The highest of these priorities was to collect, evaluate, and integrate information not only on key air pollutants of interest to the industry, but also on the attitudes of the general public on these problems and the activities of individuals or groups seeking to achieve objectives in this field. It sought to ensure, through the American Petroleum Institute, that information relevant to air pollutants and their regulation flowed continuously to key oil industry personnel and, critically, to assist industry leaders in preparing statements on controversial issues. As explained by Lloyd, the Smoke and Fumes Committee actively pushed out its messages through articles in national magazines, outreach to reporters, leaflets and brochures, and issuing running progress reports on the industry's pollution control efforts. The early history of the Smoke and Fumes Committee, and particularly its engagement on the smog debate in California, offers insight into the context in which early oil industry research into climate change was undertaken. In 1946, the year that the Smoke and Fumes Committee was founded, the Stanford Research Institute was founded in connection with Stanford University. One written history of the Stanford Research Institute indicates that Adol McBean, director of Standard Oil of California, now Chevron, was the most important of the founding fathers. In 1947, the Smoke and Fumes Committee hired the newly created Stanford Research Institute to conduct much of its air pollution research. Indeed, in its early years, 74% of Stanford Research Institute's research went to petroleum and natural gas people. And oil and gas interests were heavily represented on its board. In 1952, the Smoke and Fumes Committee was reformed within the American Petroleum Institute, with an executive of Union Oil of California, now Chevron, as its chairman. As noted earlier, the Smoke and Fumes Committee existed not just to fund and oversee research, but to actively communicate with interested organizations in industry, research, and government, and to the public. However, as the goal of the Smoke and Fumes Committee was, in part, to avoid the hasty passage of a law or laws for the control of a given air pollution situation, the committee did not simply publish all the research it sponsored. One stark example of this pattern unfolded in the debate over the causes of urban smog. By the early 1950s, scientists Ari Hagen-Smit had identified automobiles and gasoline as the primary causal agents for the pervasive smog pollution that choked Southern California in a toxic haze for decades. After California regulators accepted Hagen-Smit's theory, the Smoke and Fumes Committee launched an extensive campaign to discredit Hagen-Smit and his research. When an atmospheric chemist named Harold Johnston publicly criticized Hagen-Smit's theory, the Smoke and Fumes Committee awarded Johnston a contract with the Stanford Research Institute to review Hagen-Smit's work and disprove his theory. Unexpectedly, Johnston's work confirmed Hagen-Smith's research was correct, with Johnston himself proclaiming Hagen-Smith a genius. When Johnston shared his findings with superiors at the Stanford Research Institute, his presentation to the Stanford Research Institute Board of Directors was postponed, and his consultancy terminated. In 1954, when Vance Jenkins recounted the history of industry-sponsored air pollution research to the public, he neglected to mention Johnston's confirmation of Hagen-Smith's theory and declared, "The work at Stanford Research Institute has shown that there are a number of apparent errors, both in this theory and in its interpretation, to account for the various phenomena associated with smog." The experience of Hagen-Smith was indicative of the Smoke and Fumes Committee's work on a number of fronts, and its frequent use of industry-funded researchers to question or contradict air pollution research it considered unfavorable to industry interests. By 1958, the Smoke and Fumes Committee was funding research into an array of pollutants at a number of additional institutes, including Armour Research Foundation, Franklin Institute, and Truesdale Laboratories. In 1965, the Smoke and Fumes Committee merged with other American Petroleum Institute committees and working groups to form the Committee for Air and Water Conservation of the American Petroleum Institute. The Committee for Air and Water Conservation consisted of representatives from 20 American Petroleum Institute member companies, while major oil industry associations also send liaison representatives to the Committee for Air and Water Conservation meetings.